In this video, Jordan Peterson explains how to determine if something exists in your life.
There's an original anthropologist, an armchair anthropologist, who wrote a book called The Golden Bough, whose name escapes me momentarily. But it was one of the first attempts to do a cross-cultural categorization of mythology and to look for underlying commonalities. Now the problem is, I told you about Naomi Klein going down to Argentina and looking at the factory through her particular lens. The problem is that when you develop a lens and then you look at things through it, you may just see what that lens heightens, And I think that that's a criticism that could be leveled against the sorts of things that I'm telling you about, that I've cherry-picked certain stories and interpreted them in certain ways so that they fall coherently into a scheme of thought. And so I'll tell you some of the things that I do methodologically to protect myself against that, insofar as that's possible. So, there's this idea in psychology called the multi-method, multi-trait method of construct validation, which is, god-awful agglomeration of jargon. But it actually means something. And it was the construction of two psychologists back in the late 1950s, Cronbach and Meehl, who were interested in what psychologists meant when they said something existed. Like, say, anger. Is that a real thing? Well, what do you mean? What do you mean thing? What is it that you're talking about? What is anger exactly? I don't mean as anger, but as an idea. What sort of idea is the idea of anger, or the idea of anxiety, or the idea of sadness, or the idea of self-esteem, or self-competence, or any of these things that psychologists talk about as if they're realities? It's like, well, some realities are very tangible, right? And it's somewhat easy to come to agreement about the contours of their existence and their borders, but other things are way more difficult than that. And so their idea was that if something actually existed, you should be able to measure it multiple ways using multiple techniques and still get the same answer. And so your senses do that. You have 5 of them. And the reason you have 5, apparently, is because evolution has determined that if you only had 4, you'd die more often. So it seems as if you have 5 separate sources of information that all lead to the same conclusion. You can be relatively certain that the conclusion that's reached is real. Okay, well, the multi-method, multi-trait method is an application of that idea to construct validation, which is like, you can think of anger as an idea, as a construct. It's a terminological issue. Just define it as a construct, psychological constructs. How do you know if they're real? Well, the idea is, it's very complicated. You have to measure them in multiple ways. All the ways you measure them have to give the same reading. Then you have to show that that idea is the same in certain ways as other ideas that it's related to, and different from other ideas that it's not related to. So let me give you an example. There's a construct, neuroticism. And you might say, well, there's another construct, depression. Well, then you might say, well, are those separate or are they the same? Well, that's a tough one, because in many, many ways they're the same. Are they the same in any important, are they different in any important ways? Well, the way you do that technically is you would measure neuroticism however you were going to measure it. Maybe I'd have you tell me how neurotic you were using a questionnaire, and then I'd have your friend tell me, and maybe your parent. So we got a pretty good triangulation on your neuroticism. Then I'd have them do the same thing, all of those people do the same thing with regards to your levels of depression and anxiety. Then I'd use both those measures to predict something else, like how well your life goes in terms of career over the next 10 years. And if neuroticism predicted and depression predicted, so they were correlated, then I'd think, well, there's some relationship. And then I'd look at them at the same time. If I predict with neuroticism, and then I add depression to the mix, does that give me more predictive power? It's sort of like, does A equal C, or does A plus B equal C? That's all you're asking in a regression equation, roughly speaking. Well, if A equals C is just as good as A plus B equals C, then one of the things, especially if the two things are also correlated, depression and anxiety and neuroticism are going to be very highly correlated, like 0.7, something like that. You might say, well, those are the same thing. Just because they have different names, it's not helpful. So, and part of it is, it's a pragmatic conceptualization of reality. Is like, is this categorization structure good for something? Okay, well, so anyways, I'll unpack all that and say, well, part of my rules for determining whether these things were useful or not was to see if the ideas applied across multiple levels of analysis. So that's why I told you about the conceptual, so that's sort of the cognitive psychology, and then the neuropsychological, so there's some, input of brain research, and then the narrative or mythological, and then the cross-cultural. I think, well, those all stack up in a certain way so that if you look between all of them, you can see a pattern. And it seems to me increasingly unlikely that that pattern would be there across all of those levels at the same time. Now, you could say, well, that depends on how good you are at weaving a story. But at some point, encapsulating that many phenomena and weaving a coherent story out of them, if such a thing doesn't exist, it seems to me to become cognitively impossible. You just can't do it unless there's actually something there. So, and of course, everything I tell you also is a simplification. It has to be, because you could spend your whole life investigating any of the things that we're talking about. And so what I'm hoping is that I've abstracted out the central issues of these multiple levels of analysis, and that, put together, each of them support all the others. Anyways, who knows? I don't know, but so far so good.